fun, right? So now this is the first week where we've got all 14 teams playing conference games.
Yeah, it's fun because we've spent most of the offseason learning one team, one Big Ten team against a non-conference team. And then so you take all this knowledge, studying the tape, and then you put two of them together. You can actually match it up, and you can actually say this team has the advantage, this team has the advantage here, and it's the most fun of the season.
Some very interesting games this week. Let's start with our big story, and it was the game I was talking about just a moment ago. Certainly you are aware by now the history working in Iowa's favor against Michigan. Great success at home against ranked opponents. Winners of 5 of their last 6 against top 5 foes at Kinnick, with the only loss coming on the last play of the game. It's a run that dates back 14 years. It includes wins over 4 different foes, including Michigan back in 2016, Penn State, the most recent victim, a year ago. So let's break this one down, and we'll start with the Hawkeyes' strength, which is the defense. They lead the nation in scoring defense against Michigan's probably bigger strength, right? I mean, offensively, they're the highest scoring team in the country among teams that have played 4 games. What do you make of that matchup?
Michigan's strength is their offense, but it's taken a turn. You know, if you remember a couple years ago when Josh Gaddis first got to Michigan as the offensive coordinator, I used to call it the I spread. They had a lot of Jim Harbaugh's principles, and then Josh brought some of his principles from Alabama, and it was a kind of a blend. And then Josh's last year, which was 2021, it was more spread. It was really less I, more spread. Well, recently they've gone back to this spread I, and some of it is injuries, some of it is personnel. They got a ton of tight ends that are really good. They've got some injuries at quarterback. And so I say all that to say the way it relates to the Iowa defense is the last thing you want to do with Phil Parker, defensive coordinator at Iowa, is line up in a tight formation or a tighter formation. You would rather spread the Iowa zone defense out. You would rather isolate one of your athletes perhaps on a not as good athlete on the other side. And yet Michigan comes into this game, among all the other storylines about the stadium, with an offense that's become more conservative, and part of it is they're trying to protect JJ. You know, if JJ didn't run much option against Maryland, if he gets hurt, they drop to the third quarterback instead of Cade.
Right, with Cade McNamara out. Okay, so you saw a very different game plan then against Maryland than you had seen in previous weeks. It was almost hard to discern what the game plan was in previous weeks because they were so much better than everyone else, right? Like you wouldn't use quarterback run as much against UConn, for instance.
Absolutely, right.
Yeah.
And the downside of that, even if JJ had some good depth, is you lose the timing of it against the lesser opponents. So when you get to the better opponents, so this plays in the favor of Iowa. But Michigan semi-stumbled on some of this. I mean, they were spread and then they would go tight, and they would have success with tight. And this has happened to me as a play caller way back in the day, where this was going to be, say, a short yardage formation, and we ran it in short yardage, and they couldn't defend it. We said, hey, let's try it on 1st and 10. That actually happened to me, and I think that happened. I think some of that happened to Michigan. And, of course, Maryland, how much could they have prepped for 3 tight ends? I don't know that Michigan showed it much. And so the game changed. So now they go into Iowa, and I think mostly because of JJ keeping him healthy, I think they're going to tighten it down again, which I think helps Iowa.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about Michigan here, so let's focus in on this Iowa defense and why it is playing so well, other than the obvious, it always plays well. But what about this particular group?
Well, I don't know that it is this particular group. I think it's just the way they play defense. They're very gap sound. They play zone coverage where most teams are man. So Phil Parker, the defensive coordinator, believes eyes on the ball. That's why they get so many turnovers. It's not a corner with his back to a receiver where they don't see the ball. So I actually think this is scheme. I think, the most overused word, one of them in college football, the culture of their defense. I mean, They just do what they do, and they match up with every type of offense, and one of the reasons is because there's zone coverage.
Even by Iowa standards, this is a really good defense. They held their first 4 opponents to 10 or fewer points. First time they've done that since 1935. So it has been a while. It'll be a huge challenge, obviously, to replicate that against Michigan. Offensively, on the other side, that's where they struggle. So what about when Iowa has the ball against the Michigan defense? What's What do you see as the matchup there as they try to get enough points to stay in this game?
Yeah, let me start with the defense first. You know, this is a real example, in my opinion, of where this weak schedule of Michigan, through no fault of their own. It's not Michigan's fault, right? The Colorado State and so on and so forth, there aren't any good teams. But their defense really hadn't been tested until Maryland. And I'm not sure they're having as good a year on defense as the stats tell us because of the Maryland game and because of what they're going to face with Iowa. First of all, the crowd gets involved, right? I mean, the Iowa players know all the stats that you just said about playing in Kinnick, right? So they're going to be emotionally charged, and I think that's a big part of the game of football. They're going to be better than they were last week. I mean, it's incrementally. I mean, this is who they are, right?
Yeah,
I mean, this is why Kirk says when you want to bench the quarterback, he just says, you know, these are our best players, and they'll get better, and they do. So I think between the emotions, I don't think Michigan is playing up to their talent defensively. Again, through no fault of their own, this is going to be a tough game for Michigan on both sides of the ball. Anything can happen in this game.
What's so interesting to me is this is Michigan's first road game of the year. And I have to believe that that's always a little bit of a shock to the system. I mean, these guys have been, you know, obviously most of your guys have traveled before and have played in road stadiums. But to get acclimated to it for the first time this year and to do it in a hornet's nest, right? It is one thing to go to a stadium that doesn't have the same atmosphere as Kinnick does. But all of a sudden, I mean, for JJ, this is his first road start. Like all of that kind of stuff, I have to believe is a factor as well.
I'll tell you one thing about what I learned about JJ early in the season is he is a great athlete, has a great arm and great legs. I mean, he is pure talent. What I've learned about him recently is, man, he's young. I mean, he is making young mistakes. And to your point about going into Kinnick, and if this is like Ohio State a few years ago when they lost. You kick it off and they don't return it, but to the 15-yard line, and the Iowa defense comes on the field and the crowd is going crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, you remember when they upset Ohio State?
Yeah.
I mean, Ohio State was overwhelmed.
Oh, I mean, it was a beatdown. Yeah.
And so, you know, if that happens, that's what Michigan's going to have to contend with. You know, it's going to be a great game. I can't wait to see this game.
I agree. Michigan's
up.
not won at Kinnick since 2005. They've lost their last 4 there. So that is a crossover game. Meanwhile, I think we have a really interesting game in the West. Brett Bielema making his return to Madison with Illinois, taking on the Badgers. Illini feel good about the way that they are playing, coming off their first shutout in 7 years, I think it was, taking on a Wisconsin team that's reeling a little bit at 2-2. Bielema is going to be the focal point here media-wise. Obviously, the game starts, and it's not about Brett. But how would you handle it if you're Brett, coming back to a place that you left where you had a lot of success, but you left in a little bit of an uncomfortable and awkward spot?
Well, I've been there, especially with the very awkward leaving when I left Vanderbilt to go to LSU. And I think Brett answers it the only way a coach can answer it. I'm not saying it's the most honest answer, and I would be guilty of it as well. I mean, what are you supposed to say? If you give life to it, then it's a distraction to your team. So the only thing you can say is that it's not about me, it's about the team, and it's about the offense and the defense. And what are you going to say? Having said that, there's tremendous emotion. It was for me. There's tremendous emotion involved in a situation like Brett Bielema was in. How could it not be? Yeah. I mean, he was handpicked by Barry. It was his first head coaching job. He left to go to Arkansas, which for a lot of us didn't make any sense. He's been around the block since. And now they got shut out last year. Of course, revenge isn't a fact. Revenge isn't a motive.
Yeah.
You know, beat the heck out of me in 1 year. And
yes, less than 100 yards of offense last year.
And I won't think about it the next year. Yeah, revenge isn't a motive. So, yeah, I think there's tremendous. Now, I will say this. The players can get involved with it. I mean, I do think there's something about the locker room saying, hey, coach is going back. This is really important.
Right.
I do think that's real. And I think the players can be honest about it. But for a coach to be honest about it, I mean, you know, how can you be? It's like being honest about revenge. You know, no one really does it.
I'm going to be fascinated to see what the fan reaction is. He did have tremendous success. He did not leave under great circumstances. certainly an interesting dynamic.
Right, because you're saying someplace else is better. I mean,
Yeah.
that's why people are mad at you, right?
Yes, and someplace else is Arkansas, which I just don't think
Right,
Wisconsin
right.
fans would look at as
But even if a place was better,
right.
they
right.
still, you still said no to that.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
There's emotion.
Yes, for sure. It's a little baffling, to say the least. If you're a Wisconsin fan, and Brett had a million reasons why it made sense to him at the time. So understood. That being said, his team is really playing well. I mean, they are 3-1 right now. They very easily could be 4-0. Really let a game get away there at the end against Indiana. What has impressed you the most about the Illini?
Well, just what they're doing scheme-wise, the fact that Ryan Walters is the defensive coordinator, Barry Lunny is an offensive coordinator. Nowadays, and probably maybe for the history of the game, to have the right people running both of your schemes and to have those two people mesh, to be loyal, to all be on the same page, it's I wouldn't say it's rare, but it's not automatic. And so I think one of the things is they're playing so well on both sides of the ball because of their coordinator. Ryan Walters, defensive coordinator, their gap sounder. They're a lot like when Brett was coordinating the Wisconsin defense before Jim Leonard took over. Jim's a lot different than Brett was. So it's Brett Bielema's defense. They're gap sound. They don't have a lot of coverage. They're very down in distance. You're going to get pressure on 3rd and long, but you're not going to get pressure on 1st and 10. 2nd and medium, you're probably not going to get pressure. 2nd and long, maybe 50-50. So they're pretty conservative, but they're really well coached. And offensively, we all knew Bielema was eventually going to run the spread, right? When he was giving it to the 10.
Yeah.
We
screamed spread.
We couldn't wait to say Bielema's spread. And he loves it, right? And he's let Barry Lunny run it. And there's going to be some matchups Saturday, Rever, where Jim Leonard's going to be bringing the linebackers, and Barry Lunny, part of his offense is the quarterback takes the ball and he throws it to the perimeter right now.
Right.
And if that happens, and if Lunny times it up when Jim's bringing guys, there's going to be no pursuit. So you make one guy miss in the secondary, and it could be to the house.
That's what they do with Isaiah Williams, right? I mean, all the passes are essentially laterals to him, right? I mean, they go a couple yards over the line of scrimmage at most, and then he just goes and runs, and he's really good at doing it. No, it is funny to think about the way that Brett has adapted, and I think it's a huge testament to him. We saw this on the basketball side where John Beilein had a lot of defensive issues and finally ended up hiring essentially defensive coordinators
I remember that.
to run his defense because he said, well, this just isn't the part of the game I feel comfortable with. And I think Brett looked at the way that college football was evolving and said, okay, I understand that kind of to win the way I want to win, I'm going to need to do some different things on offense. I'm not necessarily great at these things, but I know a guy who is, and I've already hired him once before.
And think about Brett's background, okay? When he went to the NFL, the spread offense is the only thing that's ever trickled up, right? We used to take everything from the pros, right?
Yes.
They played cover 2, Tampa 2 with Tony Dungy. We stole it, right?
Yeah.
So we always stole things from the NFL. This is the first time in a generation where the NFL has taken something from colleges. So if he's in the NFL and they're running the spread with these Olympic-type athletes, why would he come back and line up in the I formation? So I think his NFL background helped him there.
What about Wisconsin right now? I mean, this is, I don't want to say it's a crisis mode right now in Madison, but you're 2-2. The expectation was that you would win the division. And not only did you lose to Ohio State, but I mean, really got hammered by Ohio State. So it's definitely a moment that I think is giving some people around the program a little bit of pause, some fans of the program thinking, hey, are we on the right track? How big a game is this for Paul? Even, I know he would never articulate this, but even with the subtext of Bielema coming back.
Yeah, it's a difficult position for Paul to be in, right? Because the perception is Illinois is having a lot of success and Wisconsin's not. I think anytime a program that has had that many head coaches have success, right? You've had Barry, and then you had Brett, and then you had Gary Anderson. He wasn't there very long, and then Paul had tremendous success. And when you get challenged, what's changed about college football and what's changed about your program? Well, I think the easy question is what's changed about your program. What hasn't changed is the offense, right? So Paul has tried to change the offense now. So Bobby Ingram's the offensive coordinator. There's some transition there, right? It just doesn't, you don't just decide not to be who you've been for all these years and it works. So that's it. And the other thing that's changed is recruiting. right? You have the NIL. So, you pick up the Madison paper or you follow Wisconsin. Where are they with the NIL? Recruiting. Wisconsin had a unique niche in recruiting. I believe that niche might be being challenged now. There's other things. For an offensive lineman, you don't just automatically go maybe to Wisconsin because they've historically had a good offensive lineman. Maybe you've gone somewhere else because, maybe you can get commercial or something. I mean, it's just recruiting's changed and the offense has changed. It's always about the acquisition of talent. So if their talent isn't as good as recently, that's why they're 2-2.
This is a series. It's a series they have dominated. The expectation is you win this game. They have won 8 straight against the Illini in Madison. See if they can keep that up.
Pressure.
It should be a fascinating game. Saturday, we are all Big Ten all morning long. Previews of every conference matchup and tons of fun directly from Minneapolis. Big Ten tailgate presented by Range Rover Sport. Saturday, 10 a.m. Eastern, only on the Big Ten Network and the Fox Sports app. Couldn't pick a better time to be in Minneapolis given the success the Gophers are having. Much of that is due to the improved quarterback play from Tanner Morgan. Just how good has he been? Well, look at this. According to Pro Football Focus, he is the highest rated QB in the nation through 4 weeks, outpacing some big names. Morgan, 7 passing TDs, 3 rushing TDs. He has yet to throw a pick. Jerry, the return of Kirk Ciarrocca has meant so much to this Minnesota program, and we had hoped before the year, I think, given the success that Ciarrocca had with Morgan. You remember 2019, he's 4th in the nation in passing efficiency. Ciarrocca went away for a couple of years. Morgan's efficiency went down considerably, and now, lo and behold, here he is again, 4th in the nation in passing efficiency and at the top of that PFF list. How does this happen? Like, how does a coordinator have that huge an impact on one individual?
Okay, I think there's 3 things that come to mind when you ask that question. Number one, let's give credit to PJ for bringing him back, right?
Yes.
Not all coaches would do that,
Yep.
but PJ is like that. The second thing is, it's an emotional program, and by that I mean we all know that PJ talks a lot about relationships and how important they are. Not that they're not important to other coaches, but we get a little bit more insight that it's very important. So you take the relationship between Kirk Ciarrocca and Tanner Morgan. It was very strong when he left, and it's very strong when he came back. So those 2 get along. Now think about this. You're coaching the offensive line, you got like 5 big guys here, and then you got another 5 behind them. You're talking to 10 guys, and they're chewing tobacco and eating a couple burgers, whatever they're doing. And a quarterback meeting, it's like this, right? I mean, so the relationship builds. The other thing, the other reason, you and I have talked about this before. So Kirk Ciarrocca goes to Penn State, it doesn't work out. He goes to West Virginia as an analyst. And it's like a sabbatical for a professor. He's not calling plays, he's studying things. So he brings new experiences back to Tanner. So the relationship's strong. They already had a really good offense, and now you can see some of the RPOs he's running. So he's varying the routes a little bit. Perfect storm, wherever is the only way to explain it. PJ says yes, relationship, studied at West Virginia, boom. And pretty good offensive line, pretty good defense, pretty good team.
Yeah, let's talk about the pretty good defense. This has been a general progression here, right? I mean, when Joe Rossi took over the defense, it was kind of in a shambles. He took over at midseason a couple of years ago, and they got a little bit better as the year went on. But then these last 2 years, I mean, it's just been night and day how much better they are. What stands out when you watch this defense? What has made him so good and allowed him to, he really, I think one of the things that we have talked about is through the years, kind of how does an offense marry with a defense? And this is the perfect marriage, right? This offense and this defense makes so much sense together. Why does Joe Rossi's defense fit so well with what PJ wants to do offensively? Okay,
again, I would start with personal relationships because Joe is absolutely a relationship guy to the whole defense. So I think he absolutely motivates the defense. I think they play for him or with him, whatever the proper expression is. Remember, we started to see Joe at Rutgers years ago, right? And they weren't very good on defense, and he had to do a lot of different things. So I think the fact that they are married to the offense, and you and I know the stat that they've taken less snaps than anybody else in the Big Ten on defense. That's because of the offense's time of possession has been close to 40 minutes. I haven't checked it this
I
week.
think it actually exceeds 40.
Okay, so I hadn't checked it.
It's absolutely crazy.
I'll check it before tailgate. And so, so that's they're on.
You saying this show's less
No.
You only check your facts before tailgate?
I knew I should.
Like that's somehow the show of records. We come here every day and we grind away. Anyway, go ahead.
I only come on Thursday. So, the scheme is fairly basic. I wouldn't call it simple, but it's again, it's well coached, it's gap sound, it's coverage sound. They don't get a lot of balls thrown over their head, and they're not on the field very often. And they should have gotten a shutout last week against Michigan State, right? They messed that up at the end. So it's the same defense he's been running for 2 or 3 years. A little bit like Phil Parker.
Yeah, and Norm.
And Norm before Phil, yeah.
Yes, I'll never forget. You're still running the cover 2, Norm. That's all I know. That was a great response, yes.
But as it relates to the game, I know we're going to get into the game.
Yeah.
I mean, could it be any worse for Purdue, right? I mean, Minnesota is
Okay, yeah, so let's go there.
Yeah.
I mean, for Purdue's point of view, you barely escaped against FAU, did not have Aiden O'Connell, and give credit to Austin Burton. I mean, he came in and certainly percentage-wise was pretty good and ran the offense, but listening to Jeff Brom's news conference this week, he said, look, we were limited in what we could do. We can't throw the ball down the field. He gave a ton of credit to Burton, but he said, we're a different team. It's unclear Aiden O'Connell's status going into this game. You're already not playing as well as you'd like to be. Purdue. So what's the challenge here against a Minnesota team that excels on both sides of the ball?
Yeah, you look at the Purdue offense. The other thing that I don't know if Jeff mentioned this in his press conference, but he changes week to week. I mean, his NFL experience where he never really started, but he played for all these different coaches. I mean, his playbook is like he's got a gazillion plays, and he's not afraid to run one against Minnesota that he hasn't run yet this year. And he's built that way. And so here you have Burton learning not a new offense this week, but it'll be different. But the biggest issue is time of possession, because PJ has married the offense and the defense. PJ is one of the few coaches in the country that cares about time of possession. Jeff Brom certainly doesn't, right? He's not a time of possession guy. So if Purdue doesn't have some extended drives, they could snap the ball 25 times the first half, maybe less. If they're 3 and out or 5 and out or 6 and out, and then if Minnesota can move the ball against the Purdue defense, then the opportunities for their offense is not going to be a lot. So this is as big a challenge as Purdue's had for a while.
These are not situations they have done particularly well, and they've lost 28 of their last 29 on the road against ranked teams, although that win did come last year against Iowa. How about Maryland and Michigan State? They are both coming off losses, but I would say that is where the similarities end to me. I would look at Maryland's loss, how close they kept it against Michigan, the fact there were some self-inflicted wounds there with the turnovers, but hey, we had some problems earlier, for instance, with penalties. They had 1 penalty in the whole game. I mean, you can point to a lot of improvement. You can point to a competitive game against a team that had blown everyone out, whereas Michigan State, I mean, they have been non-competitive 2 games in a row. So to me, this feels different. Would you agree with that premise, first of all?
Yeah, I would. I think this is such a big game for Maryland, not only season-wise, but program-wise, and for Michigan State, more season-wise than program-wise, because they certainly were outstanding last year. And the way they recruit and the way they use the portal, I mean, I think if this is a bad year, it's not going to be a string of bad years. But the opportunity that Maryland has, I mean, they played really well in Ann Arbor. Their defense has improved, like we've been saying all along. Liam had his best day. I mean, I made the comment that in tailgate that he doesn't play it in space, he plays it in outer space, meaning he just goes, right?
Yes.
He didn't do that against Michigan.
Right.
He stayed in the pocket. He was a much more polished quarterback. And so Maryland is in a position where they can beat a brand name. Not that Maryland's not a brand name, but it's not really a Big Ten brand name, right? I mean, the history is shorter here.
Yeah.
It's in College Park. They're 3-1. They can be 4-1. It would be an East Division win if they win it. So to me, it not only will help Maryland have a good year, but it could be a program-changing win.
Yeah.
Michigan State, a little different. I don't see it as a program win or loss. I just see, did we ever think that Mel was going to come in this year and lose 3 straight? And if they lose to Maryland, That's what it'll be. So micro and macro, maybe, if you would.
What do you think is going on with Michigan State? I mean, they were so thoroughly dominated in that game against Minnesota last week. I mean, just honestly, that one game, I'm not saying big picture they don't belong on the same field, but that game they did not appear to belong on the same field. I mean, Minnesota was that much better than Michigan State. I think we both believe Michigan State is better than what they showed. But what have we seen here? I mean, these last 2 weeks, they've really got blown out. I mean, games that have been over certainly by halftime, and I think you could argue even earlier than that.
I think it starts with Kenneth Walker and losing him. I mean, he didn't win the Heisman Trophy, but back in the day when everyone was running tailback and USC's tailback usually got the Heisman Trophy. I mean, when you would lose a player like that at that particular position, it impacted the entire program. And I think that's what's happened. The offensive line, are they better than last year? Are they worse than last year? I don't know. It's a coin flip.
Wash, yeah.
Pass defense last year, bad. Pass defense this year, bad. Defensive line, about the same as they were. Linebacker, they might be a little bit better, but you don't have Kenneth Walker, so you can't possess the ball, you can't run the ball. And then somebody made the comment on the call this morning, it may have been Harold, the wide receivers we're not getting any explosive plays.
Jaden Reed's been banged up.
Right. And
he was a huge part, and then you lost Jalen Naylor from last year. And
Thorne's the same as he's been. He's the same percentage completion as last year.
That fumble on the goal line changed the game, right? Like you at that point you could say, I think they were down 17-0. So at that point you could have said, go in, you get a touchdown here.
No doubt.
And you're still at least mathematically in the game, and you have a little bit of energy.
Two things about that. First of all, Mel said we're going to go down and score. That would have been true if there was no fumble.
Right.
But why was Peyton Thorne carrying the ball down on the goal line? It's a good call because schematically on the goal line, you've got to dive, quarterback, pitch, and all that stuff. But if Kenneth Walker was in the game, I think they probably would have given it to Walker instead of having Peyton carry it. So, yes, he fumbled, but he was put under tremendous pressure to make that play work.
They've been outscored 46-8 in the first half of the last two games. So it's a big game. I mean, it's just a really interesting game because you got two teams.
If I wasn't with you,
crossroads.
If I wasn't with you Saturday, I'd want to be in College Park.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, we could probably make that happen.
you want me to go?
No. You are used to hearing Joel Klatt every Saturday in the booth during Fox's Big Noon kickoff game. If you want to hear even more from Joel and his unfiltered thoughts on all the biggest stories in college football, make sure you subscribe to the Joel Klatt Show. Wherever you get your podcasts, new episodes drop 3 times a week. You can listen in now. And now is a great opportunity as well to catch up with Joel, his weekly visit with us here on Big Ten Today. Joel, thanks so much for joining us. You had Maryland, Michigan last week, so I always like to start by looking back on where we've been. I want to get your thoughts on each one of those teams. Let's start with Michigan.
Well, I thought that 4 plays masked what was an otherwise pretty even game. You had the kickoff turnover on the opening kickoff. They turned it into a touchdown right away, and then Blake Corum had those 2 long runs on short yardage plays, 4 touchdowns. And outside of that, I thought it was a really evenly played game. And I think that's a testament to Maryland, yes, but it's also, can be a cause for concern for Michigan. We wanted to know what this team was after their first 3 games, right? I mean, they did not play the level of competition that was going to lend itself to us knowing exactly who they were coming into that game. So who are they? Well, they're a defense that I thought adjusted really well. Early in the game, Rev, they were getting beat up on the interior of that defensive front 7. And by the end of the game, they were stopping the run, and they were doing it pretty consistently. And I got to credit Mozzie Smith, their defensive tackle, for playing a great game. And then on the offensive side, what they did is they had 2 young play callers that I thought got themselves to a point where they really understood what the style of game was going to be and how they wanted to attack the opposing defense. Maryland was going to sit back, play soft coverage, and force J.J. McCarthy to hold the ball and see if Michigan was patient enough to just hand it off a bunch of times to Blake Corum. And they did, 30 times. Now, he didn't have much help because Donovan Edwards wasn't there, but Blake Corum was absolutely sensational. The problem for Michigan moving forward, Rev, is that Iowa is going to be a tougher test for them for their offense than what they faced last week against Maryland. And then quickly on the Maryland side, I just think that's a vastly better team than what they were a year ago. Their offense is really good. I love their wide receivers. I thought that their offensive line played well at stretches, in particular early. I love their backfield, and that's a team that I think is going to beat somebody that we don't anticipate them to beat down the stretch. I think Mike Loxley has done a heck of a job. Remember, it was 15 penalties the week before, and they came out there 1 penalty. So they're doing the right things, and I was really impressed with Maryland.
No, agreed. They haven't beaten a ranked Big Ten team, as we know, since they joined the league. It feels like this is the year that might end for them. They need to hope that Leah Tungavailoa obviously is healthy here going forward, but really done in by those 3 turnovers, and as you said, particularly the one that opened the game and gift-wrapped the touchdown for the Wolverines. We'll talk more about Michigan and the challenge ahead against Iowa coming up here. I do want to look back on Ohio State and Wisconsin, though. That result was so lopsided. In your mind, was it more about Ohio State or more about Wisconsin?
Well, I think that's a great question. You know, we've seen them do that to people at home before. We saw them do it to Michigan State, who was an 11-win team last year. Yeah. And when it goes poorly for you early against Ohio State, man, watch out, because that offense is too good. I think they're the best offense in all of college football. They're the most balanced. They can hit you for big plays. They can throw it short and underneath. They've got the most talent on the outside. And when you do things really, really well, Cade Stover beats you. So it's like, it's really tough to defend them. That game for me was more about Ohio State. The question for Ohio State coming into this season, as you know, was not about their offense. We knew their offense was going to be spectacular. It has been. It was about their defense. Was this defense going to be a requisite defense to potentially challenge for and win a national championship? I've said this before to you. You don't generally see, in fact, going back to basically the start of the BCS, there's only been a couple of teams that have won national championships with defenses that weren't top 25 defenses. Cam Newton's Auburn team, Joe Burrow's LSU team. So you can do it with great offense, but it's really hard. And I think it's getting harder as the years go on, and in particular Georgia and Alabama and those style of teams get even deeper and better. Last year, they didn't have a defense that was even close. 2 years ago, defense wasn't close in the title game against Alabama. Now, all of a sudden, they've got a top 20 total defense. They've got a top 25 scoring defense. If they can stay there and continue to play that well, to me, that means that they're a legitimate national title contender. And that's what Saturday said to me.
What about Minnesota? What do you make of Minnesota at this point of the year, particularly after the job they did against Michigan State?
Well, I mean, how about that beatdown, right? Yeah. So, I mean, and we could, by the way, we could probably talk for 5 or 10 minutes just about Michigan State. But Minnesota is really good. Really good. They're tough at the line of scrimmage. They can run it. Their quarterback has been there, I think this is his 15th year of college football. So that's always a plus, which is nice. And PJ Fleck, I think he's underestimated. Rev, I think you would agree with me that I think PJ Fleck, in a grand scheme of things, gets underestimated because of the, I don't want to call them gimmicks because he believes in them, but because of the stuff, right? The schema and the row the boat and all of the sayings.
Yep.
But what people don't, or I guess fail then to realize, is how good of a coach he is. Look at all the places he's been. He's won everywhere. He's developed the same type of team everywhere. A team that is committed to being physical, committed to playing sound on both sides of the ball, committed to running the ball, doing the right things. And they pounded Michigan State. Say what you will about Michigan State this year, and hey, they don't play very good on the defensive side. Yeah, that's fine. Well, since Mel Tucker got there, there's been only 2 teams that have been able to gain 200 yards rushing and passing in a game on Michigan State. And it's Ohio State, no surprise, and now Minnesota. I think Minnesota is one of those teams that we can put in the same vein as the 2015 Iowa Hawkeyes and potentially the 2017 Wisconsin Badgers. It's not going to shock me, Rev, if they're in Indianapolis at 12-0. I know that sounds crazy. It's just, you look at their schedule, they're probably going to be underdogs in only one of their remaining games, which is a really tough one. I'll give it that. But against Penn State,
right.
If they stay healthy, prove me wrong. Like, I mean, they could be 12-0, they could be 11-1 in Indianapolis. I think that they're that good.
You're preaching to the converted here. I think they're really good.
You're the choir?
Yeah, no,
I got you.
I mean, they've outgained their opponents by 355 yards per game. There are 31
I mean, I will
teams
say
in the
their
country.
opponents include Colorado.
No, I
and I know
understand.
that's hard
Well,
for me.
yeah,
you
no,
were
I
going to go there. I'll go there. I'm going to break the ice for you. How about that? Like,
it hits close
Colorado's
to home, I know.
bad.
Okay, but
I was talking to PJ Fleck really quickly. I was
Yes.
talking to PJ Fleck in an interview I did with him this week, and I just brought it up. I was like, hey, man, you guys, like, you really did my alma mater dirty. And he just went like this. That was it. That was his whole answer. He just kind of like smiles at me, and I was like, that's all that needs to be said.
All right, just to put a punctuation on that, there are 31 teams in the country that don't average 355 yards per game, and they're outgaining their opponents by 355 yards a game. Again, I know not the greatest opposition, but still, it's been.
Well, I mean,
it's been
you would say Michigan
overwhelming.
State was supposed to be good
They
opposition.
were. Yes, absolutely, and they bludgeoned them. Iowa and Michigan this week, that's the game that you have. You were talking about Michigan, and this was the first time that they had faced a quality opponent in Maryland. Now, not only do they have a good opponent in Iowa and a team that is the best defense in the country by some statistical measures, but they've got to go to Kinnick, where, as we know, 5 of the last 6 teams that have had a number of 5 or better next to their name that have gone to play there have come away with a loss, and the one that won on the last play of the game. So give us a sense of what it would take for Iowa to add Michigan to that list of upset victims.
What did Coach Harbaugh say? It's like Kinnick is where top 5 teams go to die.
Yeah, it is.
And he's right. I mean, I did one of these last year. Remember, Penn State was 4th in the country.
Right.
When we did that game last year. So I don't want to be too narrow in my scope, right? A game is 1,000 things you can talk about. But Rev, I think it really comes down to, is J.J. McCarthy going to grow from last week, or is he not? Again, I know that's narrow in my scope. He was okay last week, but part of the problem is that he didn't throw the ball on time, and he held it too long in the pocket. He wasn't ready. He wasn't processing information quick enough. So he held it. And because of that, he put the ball in harm's way 2 different times in precarious situations. Both times he snapped it in the red zone. One, he takes that sack, kind of fumble, awkward. He had a check down open if he just sits there and checks it down on time, but he's back there. Ball comes loose. They end up missing the field goal. Next time, they're going now right to left. They snap it from the 19-yard line. Number 1's taken away. Number 2 is open, but he doesn't. He double pumps and then throws a corner route deep across the entire field to a double covered corner. Should have been picked off. They land out of bounds. Iowa will annihilate you if you do things like that as a quarterback. I'm not saying score and they will just, like a boa constrictor, they will just tighten and squeeze the life out of an offense. They maintain those levels so well. Phil Parker does such an outstanding job with that defense. And so if you hold the ball, generally one of 2 things happens. You throw it behind your wide receivers and you throw it over their heads. Tips and overthrows. And Iowa majors in capitalizing on tips and overthrows. What's the one way Iowa can stay in and potentially win this game? Turning them over. And it comes down to J.J. McCarthy. If he grows and throws the ball on time and processes information quickly, then Michigan's the better team. If not, Iowa's going to be right in this thing because they're going to turn them over and they're going to set their offense up in advantageous field position.
The team in the nation's intercepted more passes over the last 5 years than the Iowa Hawkeyes, and this group looks perfectly capable of continuing that trend. Joel Klatt, great stuff. As always, look forward to the call. You and Gus and Jenny coming up on Saturday.
All right, bud. Have a good one.
You too. Ohio State really cranked it up offensively after the narrow win over Notre Dame. They've averaged nearly 60 points, better than 600 yards in wins over Arkansas State, Toledo, and Wisconsin. 10 plays of 40 yards or longer in that stretch. They get Rutgers on Saturday here on the Big Ten Network. So you've got an offense, Jerry, that's every bit as good, if not better, than a year ago. I might argue the run game looks a bit better than it did last season. But the big question, I think, coming into this year was about the defense. And I'm curious what you have seen so far from Jim Knowles, D, and what conclusions you can draw from it.
Well, it took me a little bit of time to learn it, so I watched it against Wisconsin. I think they're so much improved, I think. And this is where the schedule has really helped Ohio State, whereas I think the schedule has hurt Michigan. And I was comparing those two teams, who was the best in the conference. I thought it was Michigan. Now I think it's Ohio State because of the defense. So it looks like Coach Knowles knows his personnel now, so he's playing to his personnel. Looks like his personnel knows his defense. So I think the strides they've taken, probably from spring ball to the opening game till now, has been significant. So I think this is the missing piece to the puzzle. They're running the ball better on offense, and now it looks like this is the right defense for them.
So what do you do if you're Rutgers? How do you approach a game like this where it feels like you are really overmatched?
Well, they're an option team, okay? So in theory, the option it helps a team with lesser talent, right? Because you block one less defender, because you double team somebody and read another person. So you run the option. You certainly don't go fast. You go slow, and you do some things in the special teams, which Greg Schiano is known for a lot. You just try to slow the game down. You know, you're probably a little bit more conservative on defense to stop the big plays, and you just try to keep it close and then try to win it at the end.
Were you surprised that the Iowa game went the way that it did? Not that Rutgers lost the game, but that they moved the ball through the air. They did some good things, but it really never felt like they had much of a chance of winning it.
Yeah, I was surprised at that. I actually thought that Rutgers had a really good chance of winning it going into the game. Yeah. If I look back, we don't pick the games, but I may have picked Rutgers. I mean, I thought it was that tight of a thing. But then again, it's just like Saturday at big noon. This Iowa team, they keep getting better and better a little bit at a time, and then sometimes they'll knock somebody out, and it could be Michigan. So I know I got off the subject, but yeah, I thought it was going to be closer for Rutgers Iowa.
I don't think many people come into this one thinking it's going to be particularly close. Ohio State has won all 8 of the previous meetings with Rutgers, all of them by at least 22 points. They've scored at least 49 points in every one of these games. I mean, you see the way that they overwhelmed Wisconsin. This is really challenging for Rutgers.
The only other thing I would say about Rutgers is they have made real progress this year. Don't lose that progress because you're trying to upset Ohio State. You're not trying to lose.
No, I understand.
But how much are you going to invest in it?
There is a day that you want to measure yourself against Ohio State. That day isn't here yet.
Correct.
This is not the program that you're measuring yourself against right now. Wrapping things up on Big Ten today, there was some question as to whether Penn State would be able to maintain its defensive dominance this year. They lost some star power up front, lost coordinator Brent Pry as well. Questions answered to this point. They lead the nation in passes broken up. They're top 8 in turnover margin, fumble recoveries, and fewest plays of 30 yards or longer allowed. They get struggling Northwestern this week. When we left camp, I think you had some questions. We always talk, obviously, as we're in transit to the next place. And I think you had some questions about how good Penn State would be. They thought they might be good, but weren't 100% sure. What have you seen from them to this point that has answered some of those questions?
Offensive line is better than I thought it would be. When you talk about coordinators, when you get the right coordinators and you're a head coach in the style of James Franklin, where he's not calling plays, offenses or defensively, to Manny Diaz and Mike Yurcich. Now remember, James let Kirk Shiraka go. Right. So he's a perfect fit for Minnesota. We talked about that earlier, right? Yeah. And it looks like now Mike Yurcich is a perfect fit for James Franklin. How important is that? And then Manny Diaz comes in. So I didn't know about the defense. I was like everybody else. Are they going to be able to run the ball? Did Mike want to run the ball? Did they have talent in the backfield? All things that there's no way you could tell by watching one practice, but that's what our job is to do. So we react off of it. And yet they were 5-0 a year ago, and yet this team just feels so much better. I mean,
well, it's the run game that feels different, right? Isn't it? I mean, that to me is it felt like there was so much on Sean Clifford a year ago, and then he got hurt.
Right. If there was one major improvement, it was that. But then we always blamed the offensive line, right? We always said they're not any good. Well, those guys in the backfield make those 5 guys a lot better, no doubt.
So as we mentioned, Northwestern this week, obviously it has been a brutal 3 weeks for them. We have seen this act before, right? We have seen them play very poorly in the non-conference. In 2018, they lost every non-conference game they played in the Big Ten championship game. The flip side is last year they were terrible in the non-conference and they just had a really bad year. So is there any reason to believe that this could be more like 2018?
Well, this is the tiebreaker. If this is a one-sided win by Penn State after losing to Southern and losing to Miami of Ohio, if you get blown out this week, then it doesn't feel like those years where they went to Indianapolis.